Hi, everybody, and thanks for those coming in for the second of these online public meetings. I think it was last Monday, we had one on childcare. Next week, we're going to be on health, but today we're on housing, and I'm delighted to be joined by our co-leader of Social Democrats, or sorry, the Deputy Leader of Social Democrats, I should say, Cian O'Callaghan TD. He is also our spokesperson on housing. So thanks very much for joining us, Cian. I think you were just back from canvassing, if I'm correct.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ron. Delighted to be joining you this evening.
Apologies for a bit of a late start. We had a few gremlins in the system, and hopefully they'll stay away. So maybe just kick off, Cian, because housing, it continues to be probably the one thing that dominates on the doorsteps. And I thought maybe there's a few elements to this that we could talk about. But to begin with, sometimes one of the more precarious positions that people can find themselves in is that around the rental market. And I've met far too many people in recent times who are been renting for quite some time, but because other houses have been sold, they are having to find elsewhere, and sometimes with no luck. So when it comes to the rental, maybe you might talk maybe about more of the some of the issues that you're finding as well, and I guess some of the solutions around this to help protect renters in the market.
Yeah, so I mean, very much similar. I'd certainly be meeting a good few people when I'm out and about in the constituency campaigning, and people who contact me who would be, long-term renters, maybe renting, living in a place 5 years, 10 years, 12 years, and the landlord is selling, and so they have their notice to quit, their eviction notice, and they've been a good renter, a good tenant, you like, normally always pay their rent on time, all that sort of stuff. Not necessarily had any issues, had a good relationship with the landlord, all that sort of stuff. And when you're somewhere, the longer you are somewhere, the more it becomes your home, and the more you're settled in the community, and the neighbours and might be involved in the local GA club or dance club or whatever activity it is. And then, yeah, look, back in the day when people were getting kind of notices quit or getting eviction notices, look, they'd be able to find somewhere else to rent, whereas now that can be, extremely challenging. So it puts people in a very, very difficult situation, and certainly puts some people at risk of becoming homeless. And that could be someone who's never been at risk of being homeless before, who's, always been able to rent somewhere, always up until this point been able to find somewhere and afford it. So it's a very difficult situation for people to be in, and it's a relatively unique one in terms of Ireland. Most European countries, renters in these situations, well, they wouldn't be in a situation like this. So most renters, sort of European countries, they're renting away and their landlord is selling. They stay in the property and they simply pay their rent into a different banking account, and that's as much of a difference as happened. So we've a very unusual situation that we've some of the highest rents in Europe and some of the kind of lowest amounts of security for renters. And while our rental sector, in the last few decades has doubled in size in terms of the proportion of people in the rented sector, if you like, we've gone from a very small rental sector to a kind of a more established one size-wise, but it hasn't become a more mature rental sector, if you like, in terms of rights and obligations and security.
Yeah. And I think, I guess maybe there's a tradition in Ireland, people like to own their own home, whereas in some parts of Europe, people who spend their lives renting, but they know that they are secure in their home. It might sound like in their rental, but it is their home. As you say, their children grow up, they go to the local school, they're getting embedded in the community. But we are that outlier, as you say, in terms of in Ireland, in Europe, I should say, that we don't have that level of security. In terms of then protections that renters might hope and expect for, or could expect, what sort of protections do they have then in Europe? Is there, when it comes to the length of leases and so on, how do they operate in Europe, and is that something that can be easily undertaken?
I mean, most European countries, it's they've no fault eviction. So if you pay your rent, you don't get evicted. Yeah. Basically, that's end of the story. Now, the conversation in a lot of countries is what happens if you fall behind in your rent, and how can your tenancy be saved and protected in that situation? How can there be mediation? How can a payment plan be put in place? How can that be done in a way that protects not just the renter, but also, also the landlord? And that's kind of where the conversation is around in a lot of places. Some countries, it's just simply too illegal to evict anyone into homelessness. End of story. No matter what the renter has done or not done in terms of paying rent or anything else, it's simply illegal to evict them into homelessness. So we're in a very different situation. I guess a lot of the legal situation around this in other countries is it recognizes that the renter's home is the renter's home, and there's protection around that, and other factors come secondary to that this is a person's home, a family's home, and that if they're evicted from it, that has huge impacts on them and disruptions in their life. I mean, it's interesting what you said there of, in Ireland, we're kind of used to home ownership, and people often say to me, home ownership is in our DNA in this country, and that, I mean, it's funny because it's not actually in a way quite true. So 100 years ago, when we got independence, the vast majority of people in Ireland were renting. In rural and in urban areas, nearly everyone was actually renting. It was really people only at the very top that had home ownership. And as a state, what we did is, rather than put a lot of protections in place for renters, which I guess they did in other European countries, we instead put a lot of support into people owning their own home. And that was kind of our housing project in the 20s. We got, we'd almost 80% of people ended up with home ownership, another 10% in long-term, lifelong social housing tenancies, and another 10% in the rent sector. And at the time, you go back about 30 years, people were renting. It was more so, students renting, young people leaving from home, people who happened to be moving around for work or whatever. So, and it's not that those sorts of renters shouldn't have protections, but it was less of, families for life, or, people putting down roots and needing that kind of extra level of protection. So there probably wasn't really the demand for, so home ownership was probably what was giving people the kind of security that they needed. And because it's been eroded very heavily in the last 30 years, and there hasn't been increased protections for renters significantly, it's left us quite exposed.
There seems to be also kind of a double, I wouldn't say tragedy or double peril, in that one, there's no protection for those renters, as you say, and I haven't met people and know people in this position who are now having to leave. But the second, which is on the one hand, as you say, in other countries that just doesn't exist. It's their home. They're protected to stay in it. But then the second element then is that when they are becoming evicted, there simply is no other place to go, and that there is no other place to rent. And then there are places that are possibly there to rent. The rates of the rents are so high. One of the challenges that people you hear people talk about a lot, though, is that for those who are renting properties, that there seems to be a big disjoint in terms of, though, say one person who has one property and the much larger entities that are owning vast amount of properties, and there seems to be even an unfairness even in that element that seems to be making things worse in some respects and seeing people in some ways leave the market. Is that can you talk more about that, or is that something that I guess is that something that really is a big issue as well?
Well, I mean, there's a huge difference between the way small landlords are treated and the large kind of corporate landlords in terms of, let's say, taxation. So small landlords, is typically paying a considerable amount of tax on their rental income. And then if they sell, they'll be subject to capital gains tax. So they're making, what would be, I think most people consider a fair contribution in terms of taxation, like other sectors. Your corporate landlord, by and large, through REITs, given that most of those investors are international investors, they're not necessarily from Ireland, by and large, they'd be contributing next to nothing in taxation. Now, if it's an Irish investor that's investing through a REIT or whatever, they are contributing taxation at some level. But if it's an international investor, they could be contributing nothing at all. No corporation tax, no tax on rental income, and no capital gains tax. So the way those tax structures are set up is really, there's no other investors in Ireland in a situation like that where potentially, zero tax. So there's a huge unfairness there when everybody else is contributing towards costs, and those international funds are charging very high rents and extracting significant profits.
And I know I think you may have been answering this question as well, but I certainly heard Holly answering it on one of the news outlets there yesterday regarding some of the measures that have been taken in the budget and what was put to. There was two. One I'll come back to later on, the vacant sites levy. But in terms of the stamp duty, there was a stamp duty introduced, but in many ways it's of such a rate that it's of no real value. If I'm correct with that.
Yeah, so a few years ago, when Mullen Park and Maynooth, when there was the threat of a housing estate being bought up by an investment fund under pressure, the government brought in a 10% stamp duty on the bulk purchase of homes, 10 or more homes, to try and, well, they said it was to try and be a measure to counter that. But that's been a very ineffective. Last year, in fact, the amount of bulk purchases that were taking place, I think, increased by about 56%. So the 10% stamp duty rate really hasn't been effective. We've said there should be a 100% stamp duty on bulk purchases, and that would effectively ban the practice. You see, some of these funds, international funds, are making so much money from bulk purchases of existing homes that a 10% stamp duty will merely eat into their profits in year number one or whatever. It's not a disincentive to kind of snap up these homes that otherwise individuals or families could buy. So the 10%, the now new 15%, it's just very ineffective. Some of these funds are making, they're making that 10 or 15% stamp duty, as I said, just in maybe 1 year's rental income. No bother to them, So it's not a disincentive. You need something very heavy and punitive to create a financial incentive not to do this.
I guess moving on to the kind of idea of home ownership and actually people who are looking to buy. The prices have gone up and up and up, and I was there listening to the radio last week where I think it mentioned about the price going up 20,000 in space of 3 months in some regions, and it's such a staggering amount of money to go up, especially for, I'm just thinking like a young couple. If you were to give them €20,000 and say, right, for the next 3 months, off you go on a round the world trip, you probably come back with change, and yet within that few months, that's the price of property has gone up, and the debt that's going to also then land on their shoulders, and it is so soul destroying for people who are so busy trying to work hard and save, and yet see that cost of housing continue to go away from them. And then you see houses that have 3-4 cars outside the property, which doesn't suggest that there's wealth in the property. It just suggests that oftentimes there's a number of generations of family living in the same house, grandparents and parents and kids. But I guess first thing I want to mention was this, like the unit cost of land, the very basic unit of it, and outside of towns and villages that get zoned, and then basically that's sold on to developers who then go and develop. Like that cost already is so high, and it strikes me at times it's like that at a unit price that in itself is going to drive up the price significantly. I know there's been conversations about ways and means of tackling that. What would your thoughts in terms of probably the most effective ways of tackling that have not been done over the last number of years that could be introduced?
Yeah, well, again, Ireland is an outlier on this. So we've a particular situation where, someone, a private individual can buy land, speculatively get it rezoned, maybe lobby to get it rezoned, and if they get it rezoned and they make a windfall of nothing but the fact that they've managed to buy this land and get it rezoned and get its value increased. And again, that's not possible in most countries. That's simply impossible. So a lot of countries, the way the zoning is done is that if you look at Vienna, you look in Germany, the Netherlands, the way it's often done is the state or the municipal authority buys up land, and then it changes the zoning or does the master planning on it puts in the infrastructure, the roads, the playgrounds, the parks, the amenities, and then parcels out the land for different types of housing developments. They might say we'll have some social housing over there, we'll have some affordable rental there, affordable purchase, we'll put in some housing over there for for seniors, we'll have some private housing there and whatever, so no private individual makes a windfall from the rezoning or from the uplift in the land value. And in effect, the uplift in the land value is used to pay for the infrastructure. So not only are an outlier in making some individuals really rich through rezoning their land, and when they haven't really put in any kind of effort they've just been lucky enough to get their land rezoned. We're also an outlier in terms of often delivering the infrastructure years after the housing is built.
Yeah.
So it's not strange or untypical at all for community facilities to go into a community 30 years after the housing is built and after the kids are all grown up and left the area or still living with their parents as adults in their late 20s or early 30s. At that point, the community facilities sometimes are going in because the community has campaigned and fought for them for 20, 30 years. And again, this is just unheard of, the idea that you would put the stuff in decades later after it's most needed. And of course, it makes no sense because you don't have these facilities when you have a whole load of teenagers in a new area. You don't have you don't have spaces for them to use their energy in really kind of good, productive ways. Of course, you're going to then have some negative problems from that, and then you're going to have policing costs from that and everything else, So,
yeah,
like, there's just the way we do it, utterly illogical. There was a report, the Kenny report, over 50 years ago, suggesting that a way of doing things much better would be to compulsory purchase order land when still at kind of agricultural use, and then rezone it, and then make it available for housing at affordable prices. Like, if that was done 50 years ago, implemented, we'd be in a very, very different situation with housing now. So, like, no question, that's what we need to do with our land. We need to have very active land management where a local authority or the state or the land development agency, it doesn't really matter who, is buying up the land before it's rezoned. No one's making a big profit out of rezoning land, and we're using then that saving to make housing more affordable and to make sure the infrastructure and amenities is delivered before the housing, not 20, 30 years afterwards.
and which, like, it sounds so simple, and that's I guess another tries to do, but it sounds so simple when you look at other countries and you see how it operates, and the experience of so many communities. I know here in Meath, I think of Johnstown, it's probably, it could be considered nearly the second largest town in Meath, except for the fact that it's part of Navan. I'm thinking of Enfield in the south of the constituency, that's gone from a small village of 400 or 500 to thousands, and the lack of infrastructure, and that's replicated across so many places, particularly around the commuter belt around Dublin, particularly. But you mentioned like three agencies. Then is there a case that you'd argue that one in particular would take the lead on it, or is that kind of the idea in terms of what would be the best approach to, or would you say that all three could take it at the same time, which would be would be a more coordinated approach if one or all?
Yeah, look, in one sense, what matters is that it happens. But I mean, my favorite approach would be for the land development agency to do that, for them to be assembling land for housing strategically all over the country. They could be doing that in partnership with local authorities as well.
Yeah.
They could be doing, land development agencies could be looking after larger land tracts, maybe local authorities doing smaller. But they should really be doing that, and I think that should be their primary aim. And we should be getting to the level where they're assembling land. Okay, we can start with them assembling land, for social, affordable housing. But really, where we should be going with this is that they are assembling all land for housing. So even if you're buying, private full market housing, the land should be assembled in this way. I mean, one of the things that cuts out smaller builders at the moment is they can't access land and sites. They simply can't compete with the bigger developers, and that means there's less homes being built, there's less competition, there's more of a monopoly. So ultimately getting to the point where really all land for development is coming through in that way. It's all being properly master planned, all of it is getting good amenities, infrastructure, facilities put in. And that's the way, that's where we would want to get to. And just the current model, led to terrible planning corruption in the past. But it's not corruption now, it's just wrong that
Yeah.
someone could make millions by getting their land rezoned and they've done nothing.
And I think when one of the challenges seems to be at the moment as well is that in one of the ways of trying to fix and quick fix is that oftentimes the government buying kind of properties that are already constructed. So you're buying them at quite a high price and competing against people who are trying to get into the market. So you're forcing up the price of property. Whereas if you went much further upstream to the root of this and actually, as you said, buy land, and obviously if people choose not to sell, they choose not to sell, but effectively it's working with the council, or whether it's the council themselves, they're the ones in charge of zoning. As a council, that's our reserve function. It makes so much more logical sense to go about it that way.
Yeah, and the practice as well in other countries is where there is strong CPO powers, is the compulsory purchase order powers. Usually they don't need to use them. Just the fact that they have them means they've got a good negotiating position then with a landowner, means ultimately landowner knows. Because you shouldn't, if a land is in a very strategic location and hasn't been built on, and there's a lot of infrastructure servicing that land, I do think there's a case then for ensuring that that land then is put to good kind of use for the common good, given its value, the value in that land, is effectively being created through public investment. So having those CPO powers they're rarely used, but it does help bring people to the table. And it means you don't get these piecemeal developments of a bit of housing here, a bit of housing here, a bit more housing there. Before you know it, you have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 homes, all maybe done in a piecemeal fashion, but not having the community facilities to go with it, or just having small patches of green spaces, but not enough, not enough overall. And it saves that thing of, if you 5 fields and 5 different owners, it's all going to be turned into housing. And, well, one owner doesn't want their field to be the park, do they?
No.
So
Yeah.
it means you can do things in those coordinated way where no owner loses out. They're all getting, say, paid the same amount, and then it's the municipality or the land development agency that is figuring out what goes where, and balancing that out, if you like.
I did when I did my master's in sustainable development, it's over 2 decades ago now, at Bolton Street. We went on a trip to tour to Europe, and we called into 2 locations that I thought were quite interesting and relevant. One was in Freiburg in Germany, where it was actually happened to be a military base, an old military base that had become decommissioned effectively, but it had been taken over by the municipality and developed. And what was really interesting was just the types of development that took place in terms of houses for different kind of demographics, and also just the how well it was done, how well it was planned. And I remember being struck by just how family friendly it was in terms of just toys and everything being laid around the place. But the second place we visited as well was in Belgium. And at the time, again, this is over 20 years ago, we were being told about effectively how they deal with vacant sites. And in a nutshell, it was use it or lose it, and they penalised them for not using it. It brings me back to what I mentioned earlier on in terms of a measure that was brought in the budget around trying to penalise vacant sites. But in all intents and purposes, again, it's so minimum that it has no teeth. Do you want to maybe talk as well about that and how that as a tool it has failed?
Yeah, well, but before the budget, there was a vacant homes tax of 0.5%, and there's a whole range of exemptions and that. So this is for quite a small amount of vacant homes. Now it's 0.7%, which is a minuscule increase. And look, property prices at the moment are going up on average 10% a year. So 0.5 or 0.7% tax, if your model is to sit in that property and let the value increase by 10% a year, or whatever, then a 0.5 or a 0.7% tax isn't going to make a blind bit of difference to you. So it's not as sufficient, and there's a whole rake of these things where you're getting a small measure to make it look like they're doing something, but they don't have that really kind of strong view of, we've a housing crisis, we need to take action to get empty vacant homes, or empty for no good reason, back into use. There isn't that kind of driving force. Just that kind of lack of urgency and lack of vision on it. And yeah, it's just, it's like under pressure they're doing some small actions, but they're not taking it seriously.
One of the, I'm maybe keep it to another 5 minutes perhaps, because I like to keep these meetings to the half an hour, kind of short and snappy. But one of the things as well with the bike and sites is that quite often it's the local authorities then have to follow it up, which I think there's kind of resourcing elements there. I know certainly Meath County Council, um, but something else that is not unrelated to it around staffing, and I want to talk about the planning laws that we have in the country, that they seem to be very developer friendly. And I've seen examples where developers have not adhered to the planning conditions within the county and then be told and instructed by the council once this comes to their knowledge to comply. But there was such a lack of penalties around this area. It makes no logical and financial sense for the council to really go after a developer for not adhering. It's better for them to effectively just get them to do it, get the developer to do it. There's no kind of wrap over the knuckles. I mean, if you were to drive a car and you didn't have car insurance, it's not a case that you say, "Sorry, guard, I get insurance now," and they'd let you away. Like you would probably you'd be banned off the road for a certain period of time. But the laws that exist seem to be very planning focused, and even in the last year, I guess, look, there's been new kind of planning legislation that's been going through the Dáil. Is it still as developer planning, I say, yeah, developer friendly, or is it do we expect to see it having more teeth to try and favour both authorities and also, I guess, the communities that these developments take place in?
Yeah, there's a provision after the planning tribunals, there's a provision in the planning legislation that says if a developer breaks their planning permission and conditions, the planning authority may refuse to give them planning permission again. Now, I think, to best of my knowledge, that if it's ever been implemented, and I asked the Department of Housing about this, if that clause has ever been used, it's only ever been used once in the entire country. Now, that's not because there hasn't been multiple breaches, it's because it hasn't been used. So I put an amendment into the new planning bill that's finishing up shortly to change that from may to the local authority will refuse planning permission for serious breaches of previous planning permissions. But look, the government didn't accept that amendment. So we're stuck with this may, and it seems to be a may that's never ever used. So when there isn't really consequences for breaking planning permissions, and you're right, like there's like some laws are adhered to strictly and enforced strictly, and others it's a very lapse situation.
Yeah.
So if you have a very lapse situation, then and look, some developers will try and follow the conditions very, very strictly and very well, and take all of that very, very seriously, and take their standards very seriously, and take their reputation very seriously. But having a lapse situation, kind of rewards those that don't. And then that's unfair as well then to the ones who
Yeah.
are doing everything by the book. And you'll have that as well. A good number of builders will say that to you, say that they feel it's that it's a desperately unfair situation, that they're undercut by people who don't follow the regulations, and that the system is quite weak, very weak in them. And then
Yeah.
we've now the state and the taxpayer culpable are, certainly going to have to pay out billions for fixing various different defects due to kind of a cowboy approach by some in the industry. And again, that's unfair to all the individual homeowners and residents, and then it's unfair to everyone who does things the right way and doesn't cut corners. And it's just a really, given how important, getting planning right, getting housing right, building good communities right is, and given the costs of having to fix things afterwards, and just doesn't make any sense to be lax on these sorts of things.
And I know that one of the other challenges often being that it's been it's a not even a culture, but it's effectively a system of self-regulation, effectively. So, the architects and surveyors, I guess, who are employed by the developers are the ones who are actually then oftentimes are the ones who are signing off on these things, which is not the level of oversight that is needed. Can I ask maybe then to finish up with, I guess, look, in a scenario where Social Democrats are in charge of the housing ministry and Department of Housing in a first 100 days in an ideal scenario, and I guess depending on where things happen, maybe after the election, if and when it does get called, what would you like to see? What would you envision, either within 100 days or within the year? What would be the kind of ideal scenario for
Well, the
interventions?
kind of measures you try and take straight away is things like giving the Land Development Agency strong CPO powers so it could assemble land at affordable prices. You'd want to be doing things to strengthen protections for renters, so renters who pay their rent aren't getting evicted into homelessness. But really, in terms of increasing affordable supply, both rental and affordable purchase, that would be one of the big projects for the Social Democrats in government. And that wouldn't be a 100 days kind of scenario, but what you'd be trying to do in the 100 days then is set realistic targets on that for the next 5 years. At the moment, the government's housing targets are completely insufficient. They've admitted that for years now. They've talked about for years about revising them upwards. They are saying that they're going to revise them upwards now in the next few weeks. So lo and behold, just before an election is called, they are finally going to revise the targets somewhere up to where they're needed. I mean, it's just pathetically late. But the kind of plan you'd be putting in place, in the first 100 days would be around affordable housing, affordable purchase housing. We're actually publishing very shortly our plan on affordable purchase housing and showing in a kind of detailed, costed way how we could build thousands of affordable purchase homes each year. So you'd be getting those targets in place from the start, getting the funding in place, and then it would take a bit of time to build those out and indeed to scale up what you're doing each year. I mean, you do have to go through the planning process, procurement before you get to construction and all that. So, but there's no reason why within a few years we shouldn't be building 10,000 affordable purchase homes a year, and then affordable rental and social housing. And then that would get our overall housing delivery numbers up very significantly, and would mean a good chunk of those are affordable. So that would benefit the individuals who avail them, but it would also have a calming effect on rents and house prices more generally. And that's where we need to go. It's what can be done. We have the resources for it as a country. When we had very few resources as a country 100 years ago, we were building affordable purchase housing, literally when we were just trying to rebuild O'Connell Street after 1916 and the Civil War and that. Of course it can be done.
Yeah. Well, let's finish then on with that positive note, or at least optimistic note of what is possible. Because I think far too many people, I think, feel that after 15, 20 years of the same, that there isn't any way of resolving this, when in fact there's many, and there's plenty of evidence and examples elsewhere in continents to show that. I appreciate taking the time out, Cian. I know you had a long evening out the doors. So thanks very much for joining us, and I guess thanks everybody as well for joining us at home. We'll be having this recorded and put up online. And next Monday, our hope we'll be joined by Cian O'Callaghan TD, who's our spokesperson on health, Social Democrats, and we'll be talking about that very issue of health. And thanks, Niamh, in the background as well for the technical, and I'm glad the Gremlin stayed away. Thanks again, appreciate that.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, everyone.